history, horror, and the long echo of violence. This isn't jump scares. This is the kind of horror that haunts a people. Welcome to the library. My name's Topher, and this is a 5-minute book review of The Buffalo Hunter Hunter by Stephen Graham Jones. The story is set in 1912 Montana and beyond, and it's told through a hidden pastor's diary as well as some confessional interviews. And what this story manages to do is a really interesting narrative hook that is always intentional, even if it's not necessarily always exciting. Some of the big themes that are very clearly seen throughout this story are colonialization, displacement, revenge, and how violence kind of ripples out throughout history and continues to cause more pain than just necessarily the inciting event. Certainly, there's a theme of loss and the obvious just uh, repercussions of westward expansion, particularly for Native peoples here in America. While there are several different characters throughout the book, our main characters are Goodstab, a Native American, and Arthur, who is a Lutheran pastor. And it's really their interactions that we're seeing throughout the story. Here's what worked for me. This is the type of horror that exposes, doesn't shock. And by that I mean it's not a horror novel that is just unnecessarily graphic. It's not a horror novel that just exists for shock value or jump scares or to try and creep you out to the nth degree. This is the type of horror novel that really exists to expose the realities of horrors that exist not just necessarily in a country or what people experience, but also the horrors that can sometimes live within us and come out of us as humans. There's a lot of creeping dread. There's certainly a lot of interesting takes on a familiar kind of horror monster or villain. But there's also a lot of emotional weight and some really deeply thought provoking aspects as the story and the narrative goes to its final conclusion. And even where the story ends isn't exactly where I thought it would end, and it lands in a way that, I don't know, made me feel really satisfied. This is my first Stephen Graham Jones novel, and I think he writes with a really confident hand. Like, he really seemed to know exactly where he wanted to go with this novel, and that sure-footedness plus his own experiences and him being of native descent lend this story just a level of authenticity that make it even more engaging than just the narrative itself. Now, if I'm honest, there's not a lot that didn't work for me in this novel. Most things did. I do think a few people would probably have a little bit of a challenge with the intentional language. Again, because this isn't just a jump scare, like fast moving train of a story. It's one that lingers and kind of builds dread, and there's a lot of heartbreak, and there's so much depth in story that if you're looking for something that's a super fast pace, this isn't going to be it. But if you allow yourself to just kind of rest in the story and lean into it and just kind of sink into it, I really think you're pretty richly rewarded. I think another thing that may be a little off putting to some, depending on personality or really biases, is while I don't think the language is necessarily heavy handed, it is very pointed. And there are some out there that just want escapism. They don't want to have to think of the realities and the horrors of the real world, and they don't want to have to think deeply about their nation's actions or responsibility to things that have happened in the past. And so, because the language is pretty pointed and I would even argue confrontational, which again didn't bother me, I could definitely see this being a little off-putting to some if you're not in that mindset. Now, in these 5-minute reviews, I really break down my recommendation into one of three categories. Just read it. If you have time, read it, or it's your time, not mine. I didn't like it, but you might. And with this book, it is definitely a just read it. I don't think you'll be disappointed. There are definitely some graphic scenes. There are a lot of real horrific things that happen, but the depth and complexity of the characters, the way the story flows, the interesting take on kind of familiar tropes that Stephen Graham Jones does, all play into just a wonderful and intriguing and engaging horror novel that honestly I can't recommend enough. Now, if you are a horror fan, I have another video I posted recently called 10 Great Horror Novels for Your Autumn Reading that I'd love for you to check out. With that, I'm going to say goodbye, and as always, stay curious, read deeply, and I'll see you in the library.